My brother told me I was no longer needed at the farm after our father's funeral, standing in the barn I'd worked in for 15 years while he'd built his law practice in Savannah. If you want to know what happened when he tried to claim land I'd earned with my own hands, stay with me because the soil remembers who tends it, even when the paperwork says otherwise. I am a farmhand. Not a farmer, not an owner, just someone who works the land. For 15 years, that's what I did on my father's farm in Savannah, 300 acres of cotton, soybeans, and produce. I woke before dawn, checked irrigation lines, operated equipment, hauled feed, mended fences, and fell into bed after dark smelling of soil and sweat and honest work. My father, Edward Granger, bought the farm when I was 12 and my brother Caleb was 16. Caleb hated it immediately, the heat, the mud, the relentless physical labor. He left for college at 18, studied law, built a practice in downtown Savannah representing developers and corporations. He came home for Christmas and Thanksgiving, stayed in his childhood bedroom, and left without ever setting foot in the fields. I stayed. I dropped out of college after one semester because Dad had a health scare and needed help, and one semester turned into 15 years. I told myself I'd go back eventually, finish my degree, do something else. But the farm had a way of holding you. There was always one more season, one more harvest, one more thing that needed fixing. Dad paid me a salary, not much but enough to live on. I had a small house on the property, a pickup truck, a simple life. I didn't mind. The work was hard but honest, and I liked the rhythm of it, planting, tending, harvesting, repeat. You put work into the ground, and the ground gives back. Simple. Dad got sick when I was 33. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, caught too late. He lasted 6 months. In those months, he got thin and gray, but he still walked the fields when he could, checking on things, telling me what needed doing. He said the farm would be taken care of, that I didn't need to worry. I didn't ask what he meant. I trusted him. The funeral was on a Tuesday in October, during harvest season. The church was full, neighbors, other farmers, people from town who'd known Dad for decades. Caleb flew in from Savannah with his wife, Amanda, both of them dressed like they were attending a corporate event. Caleb gave the eulogy, talked about Dad's integrity and work ethic, values he'd instilled in his children. I sat in the front pew and said nothing. After the service, after the burial, after the reception at the church hall, Caleb asked me to meet him at the barn. He said we needed to discuss the estate. I met him there at sunset. He was standing near the tractor, still in his funeral suit, looking out of place against the dirt and machinery. He said, "Claire, I wanted to talk to you about the farm." I said, "Okay." He said, "Dad left everything to me. The land, the house, the equipment. It's all in the will." I felt something cold settle in my chest. I said, "Everything?" He said, "Yes. I'm the executor and the sole heir. It's a standard arrangement, oldest child inherits the family property." I said, "What about me?" He said, "You've been living here rent-free for 15 years. You've had a salary, a place to stay. That's more than fair." I said, "I've worked this land for 15 years, Caleb. I've kept it running." He said, "And you were paid for that. But the farm itself belongs to me now. And frankly, I don't think it's sustainable to keep operating it the way Dad did. I'm planning to sell." I said, "Sell?" He said, "There's a development group interested in the land. They want to build a residential community. The offer is substantial." I said, "This is a working farm." He said, "It's an asset. And I'm liquidating it." I felt the ground shift beneath me. I said, "When?" He said, "I'm meeting with them next week. I'll give you 60 days to find other housing and employment. That should be sufficient." I said, 60 days. He said, "I know this is difficult, but it's business. You'll be fine. You're young, capable. You'll find something else." I looked at him, my brother, in his expensive suit and polished shoes, And I thought about the 15 years I'd spent in the fields while he built his career in air-conditioned offices. I thought about the harvests I'd brought in, the equipment I'd maintained, the land I'd tended while he sent Christmas cards once a year. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I said, okay. He looked surprised. He said, okay? I said, if that's what the will says, then okay. He relaxed slightly. He said, I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I'll have my assistant send you the formal notice. He walked back to his car, and I stood in the barn as the sun set, turning the fields gold and red. And I thought, the soil remembers who tends it. Even when the paperwork says otherwise. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table in my small house, the house I'd lived in for 15 years, the house Caleb now owned, and thought about what Dad had said in those final months. The farm will be taken care of. You don't need to worry. He'd said it more than once. I'd assumed he meant the land would keep producing, that the operation would continue. But maybe he'd meant something else. The next morning, I drove into Savannah and went to see Dad's attorney, a man named Richard Boyle who'd handled the family's legal affairs for decades. His office was in an old building downtown, the kind with creaking floors and tall windows. Richard was in his 70s, white-haired and deliberate. He greeted me with sympathy, offered condolences, and asked how I was holding up. I said, I need to see my father's will. He said, your brother is the executor. He should have provided you with a copy. I said, he told me the farm goes to him entirely. I want to verify that. Richard's expression shifted slightly. He said, let me pull the file. He returned a few minutes later with a folder. He opened it, scanned the first few pages, then looked up at me. He said, did Caleb mention the codicil? I said, what codicil? Richard turned the document toward me. He said, your father amended his will 6 months before he passed. The amendment creates a separate provision for you. I read the page he indicated. The language was dense, full of legal terminology, but the substance was clear. In recognition of Claire Granger's 15 years of service and dedication to the operation and maintenance of the family farm, the water rights and mineral lease associated with the property are hereby bequeathed to Claire Granger in perpetuity, separate from the land title itself. I looked up at Richard. I said, water rights? He said, your father's property sits above the Floridan aquifer. The water rights grant you control over any water extraction from the land, including agricultural use and any commercial applications. I said, and the mineral lease? He said, there's an existing lease with a natural gas company. It's been generating royalty payments for the past 8 years. Your father never touched the money, he set it aside in a separate account. That account now belongs to you. I felt dizzy. I said, how much? Richard pulled another document from the file. He said, the account currently holds approximately $340,000. The lease generates about $30,000 annually, sometimes more depending on extraction rates. I stared at the number. I said, Caleb doesn't know about this. Richard said, apparently not, or he would have mentioned it. I said, what happens if he sells the land? Richard said, the water rights and mineral lease transfer with you, not with the land. Any buyer would need to negotiate with you separately for access to water and mineral extraction. Given that this is a working farm, water access is essential. Without it, the land value drops significantly. I said, so the development group? Richard said, would need your permission to access water for any residential development. And you're under no obligation to grant it. I sat back in my chair. I thought about Caleb in the barn, telling me I was no longer needed, giving me 60 days to vacate. I thought about Dad in those final months, walking the fields, telling me not to worry. He'd known. He'd known exactly what Caleb would do, and he'd planned for it. I said, why didn't Dad tell me? Richard said, I asked him that. He said he wanted you to discover it when you needed it most. He said you'd know what to do. I said, what do I do? Richard said, "That's up to you. But if I were you, I'd wait until your brother tries to finalize the sale. Then inform him, and the buyers, that they'll need to negotiate with you for water access." I said, "And if they don't want to negotiate?" Richard smiled, a small, knowing smile. He said, "Then they don't have a viable development. And your brother doesn't have a sale." I left Richard's office and sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about the 15 years I'd spent working the land, the sweat and exhaustion and quiet satisfaction of a job done well. I thought about Caleb dismissing all of it with 60 days' notice and a lecture about business. I thought about the soil, and the water beneath it, and the rights Dad had quietly set aside for the daughter who'd stayed. I didn't call Caleb. I didn't confront him. I drove back to the farm, parked the truck, and walked out into the fields. The cotton was nearly ready for harvest, the bolls white and heavy on the stalks. I ran my hand over them, felt the fiber between my fingers, and thought about the cycles of growth and harvest, the way the land gives back what you put into it. Caleb thought the farm was just an asset, something to liquidate and convert into cash. But the land was more than that. It was water and soil and minerals and rights, layers of value he'd never bothered to learn about because he'd never bothered to stay. I would wait. I would let him move forward with his sale, let him believe he'd won. And then I would remind him that the soil remembers who tends it. Even when the paperwork says otherwise. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued working the farm as I always had. I harvested the cotton, repaired a broken irrigation line, prepped the equipment for winter storage. Caleb didn't visit. He sent his assistant, a young man in khakis and a polo shirt, to take photos of the property for the development group's assessment. The assistant walked the fields with a camera and a clipboard, making notes. He asked me a few questions about yields and soil quality. I answered briefly, politely. He didn't ask about water access. I didn't volunteer the information. 3 weeks after the funeral, Caleb called. He said the development group had made a formal offer, $2.8 million for the 300 acres. He said the deal was moving forward, that closing would happen in 60 days, and that I needed to start making arrangements to vacate. I said, "Okay." He said, "You're being very reasonable about this, Claire. I appreciate it." I said, "It's your land." He said, "Exactly." After we hung up, I sat on the porch of my small house and watched the sun set over the fields. The land looked peaceful in the fading light, rows of harvested cotton stretching toward the horizon. I thought about what it meant to tend land. Not own it, not profit from it, but tend it. To know its rhythms, its needs, its quiet language of soil and water and seed. Caleb had never learned that language. He saw property lines and market value, assets and returns. But I knew what lived beneath the surface. And soon, he would too. I called Richard Boyle the next morning. I said, "The sale is moving forward. When do I inform them about the water rights?" He said, "I'd recommend waiting until they've completed their due diligence but before they finalize the purchase agreement. That's when the information will have maximum impact." I said, "How will they react?" He said, "They'll be upset. They'll try to negotiate. Your brother will be, well, let's say surprised." I said, "Good." Richard said, "Claire, I should mention, your brother could try to challenge the codicil. Claim your father wasn't of sound mind, that you exerted undue influence. It's a long shot, but it's possible." I said, "Can he win?" Richard said, "No. I drafted the amendment myself, with a full competency evaluation from your father's doctor. It's airtight. But he might try anyway." I said, "Then I'll deal with that when it happens." Richard said, "You're more like your father than you know." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Patient. Strategic. Willing to let someone else make the first mistake." After we hung up, I went back to work. I cleared debris from the drainage ditches, checked the fence lines, organized the equipment shed. The physical work felt good, grounding, a reminder that I knew this land in ways Caleb never would. For weeks after the funeral, Caleb called again. He said the development group had completed their assessment and were ready to move to contract. He said I needed to be out of the house in 30 days. I said, I'll need a forwarding address for some paperwork. He said, what paperwork? I said, from Dad's estate. There are some documents that need your signature. He said, send them to my office. I said, okay. I hung up and called Richard. I said, it's time. Richard said, I'll draft a letter to the development group and your brother, informing them of the water rights and mineral lease. I'll send it tomorrow. I said, what do you think will happen? He said, I think your brother is about to learn a very expensive lesson about assumptions. The letter went out the next day. I didn't hear anything for 48 hours. Then Caleb called. He didn't say hello. He said, what the hell is this about water rights? I said, Dad left them to me. It's in the will. He said, that's not possible. I reviewed the will. There's nothing about water rights. I said, it's in the codicil. The amendment he added 6 months before he died. There was a long silence. Then he said, you knew about this. I said, I found out after the funeral. He said, and you didn't think to mention it? I said, you didn't ask. He said, this is sabotage, Claire. You're trying to tank the sale. I said, I'm not doing anything. I own the water rights. That's just a fact. He said, the development group needs water access. Without it, the deal falls apart. I said, then they should negotiate with me. He said, how much do you want? I said, I don't know yet. He said, this is extortion. I said, no, Caleb. This is inheritance. The same way the land is yours. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dad did this on purpose. I said, yes. He said, he wanted to punish me. I said, no. He wanted to take care of me. There's a difference. He hung up. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the development group's attorney. They requested a meeting to discuss terms for water access and mineral rights transfer. The tone was polite but strained, the kind of politeness that barely conceals frustration. I called Richard. I said, they want to meet. He said, I'll attend with you. Don't agree to anything on the spot. Let them make their offer first. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a conference room in downtown Savannah. I drove in wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt, the nicest clothes I owned that weren't funeral attire. Richard met me in the lobby, carrying a leather briefcase. He said, remember, you hold all the leverage here. They need you more than you need them. I nodded, but my stomach was tight with nerves. The conference room was on the 3rd floor, all glass and polished wood. 3 people were waiting, a man in his 50s who introduced himself as Dale Winters, the lead developer, a woman in her 40s named Patricia Song, the project manager, and Caleb. Caleb looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He didn't make eye contact with me. Dale gestured to the chairs. We sat. He said, Ms. Granger, thank you for coming. We wanted to discuss the water rights situation. I said, okay. He said, as I'm sure you're aware, our development plan requires access to water, for residential use, landscaping, infrastructure. Without guaranteed water access, the project isn't viable. I said, I understand. Patricia said, we've reviewed the codicil. The water rights are clearly yours. We're prepared to negotiate a fair price for transfer of those rights. I said, I'm listening. Dale slid a folder across the table. He said, we're offering $150,000 for full transfer of water rights and mineral lease, with immediate payment upon closing of the land sale. I looked at the number. I thought about the $340,000 already sitting in the account from the mineral lease, the $30,000 in annual royalties I'd continue to receive if I kept the rights. I said, no. Patricia said, we can negotiate. What figure did you have in mind? I said, I'm not selling the rights. Dale frowned. He said, Ms. Granger, be reasonable. We're offering a substantial sum. I said, I don't want a sum. I want the rights. Caleb spoke for the first time. He said, Claire, this is insane. You're killing a $2.8 million deal over stubbornness. I looked at him. I said, I'm not being stubborn. I'm keeping what Dad left me. Dale said, if you're concerned about compensation, we can increase the offer. I said, it's not about the money. Patricia said, then what is it about? I said, this land has been in my family for 30 years. I've worked it for 15 of those years. I've tended it, maintained it, kept it producing. And now my brother wants to sell it to build houses, and you want me to hand over the water rights so you can pave over everything I built. Dale said, we're not paving over anything. We're developing the land to its highest and best use. I said, the highest and best use is farmland. That's what it is. That's what it's been. Caleb said, you're being emotional. I said, no, Caleb. I'm being clear. You get the land because Dad left it to you. I get the water rights because he left them to me. If you want to sell, that's your choice. But you'll sell land without guaranteed water access, which means the value drops. That's not my problem. Dale said, Ms. Granger, without your cooperation, this deal doesn't happen. Your brother loses the sale. You lose the opportunity to benefit from the development. I said, I'm already benefiting. The mineral lease pays me $30,000 a year. I'll keep receiving that whether you build houses or not. Patricia said, but you could have $150,000 now, plus the security of. I said, I don't need security from you. I have the water rights. That's all the security I need. Richard leaned forward. He said, my client has made her position clear. She's not interested in selling the water rights. If you'd like to propose an alternative arrangement, a lease, perhaps, or a royalty structure, we're willing to listen. But full transfer is off the table. Dale and Patricia exchanged a look. Dale said, we'll need to discuss this with our investors. Richard said, of course. You have our contact information. The meeting ended. Caleb followed me into the hallway. He said, you're doing this to punish me. I said, no. I'm doing this because it's mine. He said, Dad left me the farm. I said, he left you the land. He left me the water. There's a difference. He said, you're going to regret this. I said, maybe. But it'll be my regret, not yours. I walked away. The development group came back 2 days later with a revised offer, a lease structure for water access, $50,000 annually for 20 years, with an option to renew. They'd also pay $100,000 upfront as a signing bonus. Richard called to relay the offer. He said, it's a reasonable proposal. You'd maintain ownership of the rights while generating significant income. I said, what happens to the mineral lease? He said, that remains separate. You'd continue receiving royalties from the gas company. I said, so I'd get $50,000 from the development, plus $30,000 from the gas lease, plus the upfront $100,000. He said, correct. And you'd retain long-term control of the water rights. I thought about it. I thought about the farm, the land Dad had worked, the fields I'd tended. I thought about what it would look like covered in houses, sidewalks, driveways. I said, what happens to the farmland if they develop it? Richard said, it's gone. Converted to residential use. I said, and if I say no to the lease? He said, the development deal falls apart. Your brother would need to find another buyer, likely at a significantly lower price since the land has limited water access. I said, how much lower? Richard said, hard to say. Maybe half the original offer, maybe less. Farmland without water rights isn't worth much for development. I said, but it's still worth something as a working farm. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, are you thinking of buying the land yourself? I said, could I? He said, potentially. If the development deal falls through and your brother is motivated to sell, you could make an offer. Between the mineral lease account and a loan against future royalties, you might be able to structure a purchase. I said, how much would I need? He said, for 300 acres of farmland with limited water access? Maybe 1.2 to 1.5 million. You'd need to put down 300,000 to 400,000 and finance the rest. I said, I have 340,000 in the mineral lease account. Richard said, then it's possible. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, tell the development group I'm declining their lease offer. Richard said, are you sure? I said, yes. He said, this will likely kill the deal. I said, I know. Richard said, your brother is going to be very upset. I said, I know that too. I hung up and sat on my porch, looking out over the fields. The cotton harvest was done, the land resting before winter planting. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. I thought about what Dad had said, the farm will be taken care of. I thought he meant the land would continue, that someone would keep it running. But maybe he'd meant something more specific. Maybe he'd meant I would take care of it. Not as a hired hand. As an owner. The development deal fell apart within a week. Dale Winters called Richard to say they were withdrawing their offer, that the project wasn't viable without guaranteed water access. Caleb called me the same day. He said, you've destroyed this family. I said, I made a choice about my inheritance. He said, your inheritance was meant to supplement the sale, not sabotage it. I said, Dad didn't see it that way. He said, you have no idea what he intended. I said, neither do you. He said, I'm selling the land anyway. I'll find another buyer. I said, okay. He said, and I won't forget this, Claire. You've made an enemy. I said, we were never friends, Caleb. You just didn't notice. He hung up. 2 months later, Caleb listed the farm with a commercial real estate broker. The asking price was $1.6 million, nearly half the original development offer. The listing emphasized the acreage and soil quality but noted in small print that water rights were held separately. I waited. Weeks passed with no offers. The land sat, dormant and unwanted, too expensive for most small farmers and too restricted for developers. Then, 3 months after the funeral, Caleb's attorney contacted Richard with a proposal. Caleb would sell me the farm for $1.3 million, with $350,000 down and seller financing for the remainder at a reasonable interest rate. Richard called to relay the offer. He said, he's desperate. The land isn't moving, and he needs to liquidate. I said, why would he offer seller financing? Richard said, because he knows you're the only buyer who can make this work. You have the water rights, which makes the land valuable again. And he'd rather get something than nothing. I said, what are the terms? Richard said, 10-year note, 5 interest, balloon payment at the end. You'd own the land outright, subject to the loan. I said, can I afford it? Richard said, with the mineral lease income and conservative farm revenue, yes. It'll be tight, but manageable. I thought about the 15 years I'd spent working the land. I thought about Dad walking the fields, telling me not to worry. I thought about the water beneath the soil, the minerals deeper still, the layers of value Caleb had never bothered to understand. I said, tell him I accept. The sale closed in April, just as spring planting season began. I signed the papers in Richard's office, Caleb on one side of the table, me on the other. We didn't speak beyond what was necessary. When it was done, Richard handed me the deed. I walked out owning 300 acres of farmland and owing my brother $950,000. I didn't care. The land was mine. I hired 2 workers to help with planting, couldn't manage 300 acres alone. I took out a small operating loan to cover seed and equipment maintenance, budgeted carefully, reinvested every dollar I could spare. The first year was brutal. Equipment broke down, yields were lower than projected, and the loan payments were a constant weight. But the mineral lease kept paying $30,000 annually, steady and reliable, and I made the payments on time. Caleb never visited. He sent the payment reminders through his attorney, impersonal and curt. I sent the checks the same way. By the third year, I'd stabilized. I'd improved irrigation efficiency, diversified crops to include high-value produce for local markets, and built relationships with restaurants and farm-to-table suppliers in Savannah. The farm was profitable, not extravagantly, but enough to cover the loan and provide a modest living. I hired a part-time manager, a retired farmer named Leonard who knew the land as well as I did. He took over the day-to-day operations while I focused on business development and finances. In year 5, the natural gas company renewed the mineral lease at an increased rate, $45,000 annually. I used the extra income to pay down the principal on Caleb's note ahead of schedule. In year 7, I paid off the balloon payment in full, 3 years early. The farm was mine, free and clear. I called Richard to tell him. He said, "Your father would be proud." I said, "I hope so." He said, "I know so. He always said you understood the land better than anyone." I said, "Caleb never believed that." Richard said, "Caleb never stayed long enough to learn." I sat on the porch that evening, looking out over fields I now owned outright. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cotton was waist-high, the soybeans just starting to flower. Everything was green and growing. I thought about the day after the funeral, Caleb in the barn telling me I was no longer needed. I thought about the anger I'd swallowed, the plan I'd formed, the patience it had taken to wait for the right moment. I thought about the water rights Dad had set aside, the quiet gift he'd left for the daughter who'd stayed. And I thought about what it meant to tend land, not just to own it, but to know it, to work it, to let it work you in return. Caleb had seen the farm as an asset, something to liquidate and convert to cash. But the land was never just an asset. It was soil and water and minerals, yes, but also time and knowledge and care. You can own land without understanding it. But you can't make it thrive. I learned that from my father. And I proved it over 7 years of sweat and strategy and stubborn refusal to let my brother's vision of value override my own. Some things can't be measured in a sales price. Some things are worth more than the market says they are. And some victories are quiet, earned not in courtrooms or dramatic confrontations, but in the steady work of building something that lasts. 8 years after the funeral, I expanded the farm to include agritourism, farm tours, a small farm stand, seasonal events. It brought in additional revenue and connected the community to the land in ways that mattered. I met someone during this time, a veterinarian named Marcus who came out to treat one of the farm dogs. He was quiet, thoughtful, comfortable with silence. We started having coffee, then dinner, then long conversations on the porch while the sun set. He asked about the farm, how I'd come to own it. I told him the whole story, the funeral, the water rights, the development deal, the 7 years of debt. He said, "You outplayed your brother." I said, "I outweighted him." He said, "What's the difference?" I said, "Playing is about winning. Waiting is about knowing when to act." He nodded. He said, "That's wisdom." I said, "That's farming." We got married 2 years later, a small ceremony on the farm with a handful of friends and neighbors. Leonard walked me down the aisle between rows of cotton. Marcus's vows included a promise to never ask you to choose between me and the land. I cried when he said that. We built a life together, splitting time between the farm and his veterinary practice. He understood the rhythms of agricultural life, the long days during planting and harvest, the quieter winters. He never asked me to be smaller than I was. 10 years after the funeral, I received a letter from Caleb. It was brief, handwritten, mailed to the farm. It said, "Claire, I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately. I realize now that he knew exactly what he was doing with the will. He knew I'd try to sell, and he knew you'd find a way to keep it. I was angry about that for a long time. I'm not anymore. You were right, you earned that land. I just inherited it. I hope you're doing well. Caleb. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I didn't respond immediately. I let it sit for a few weeks, thinking about what to say, if anything. Finally, I wrote back, Caleb, thank you for the letter. I don't know if Dad planned everything or just trusted that things would work out the way they needed to. Either way, I'm grateful. The farm is doing well. I hope you are too. Claire. I mailed it and didn't expect a reply. I didn't get one. But 6 months later, Caleb showed up at the farm. He called ahead, asked if he could visit. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, driving a sedan that looked out of place on the dirt road. Marcus was at the clinic, so it was just me. Caleb got out of the car and stood looking at the fields for a long moment. He said, "It looks good." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Can we walk?" I said, "Sure." We walked the perimeter of the cotton fields, past the irrigation lines and the equipment shed and the small farm stand. Caleb didn't say much, just took it all in. Finally, he said, "I didn't understand what this place meant to you." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought it was just a job. Something you did because you didn't have other options." I said, "It was more than that." He said, "I see that now." We walked in silence for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry. For the way I handled things after Dad died. For dismissing you." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Do you forgive me?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I'm not angry anymore. But I also don't forget." He nodded. He said, "That's fair." We walked back to his car. Before he left, he said, "You did what I couldn't. You made this place thrive." I said, "You could have, if you'd stayed." He said, "No. I couldn't have. I never had the patience for it." He got in his car and drove away. I stood in the driveway, watching the dust settle, and thought about the 15 years I'd spent as a farmhand, the 7 years I'd spent paying off the land, the years since building something sustainable and real. Caleb was right, I'd made the place thrive. But not because I was smarter or more capable. Because I'd stayed. Because I'd learned the language of soil and water and seasons, and I'd refused to let anyone convince me that language wasn't valuable. 12 years after the funeral, I received an offer for the mineral lease rights. The natural gas company wanted to buy them outright, $850,000 for full transfer of the lease. I discussed it with Marcus. He said, "That's a lot of money." I said, "It is." He said, "What would you do with it?" I said, "I don't know. Expand the farm, maybe. Invest it. Save it." He said, "Or you could keep the lease and keep getting the annual payments." I said, "Which is what?" He said, $45,000 a year, guaranteed. Over 20 years, that's $900,000, and you still own the rights after. I said, "But $850,000 now is a sure thing." He said, "So is $45,000 a year if the lease holds." I thought about it. I thought about the water rights, the quiet leverage they'd given me, the way they'd been the key to everything. I said, "I'm keeping the lease." Marcus said, "Why?" I said, "Because some things are worth more than their sale price." He smiled. He said, "That's very you." I called the gas company and declined the offer. The lease payments continued, steady and reliable, $45,000 every year. I used the income to fund a scholarship for children of farm workers, kids who wanted to study agriculture or environmental science. It wasn't a huge fund, but it helped 3 or 4 students a year, and that felt right. 15 years after the funeral, the farm was fully paid off, profitable, and stable. I'd built a small house on the property for Leonard, who'd become more than an employee. He was a partner, a mentor, a friend. He managed the day-to-day while I focused on expansion and community outreach. The agritourism side had grown, school groups came for tours, families visited the farm stand, we hosted a harvest festival every October that drew hundreds of people. I'd become something I never planned to be, a landowner, a businesswoman, a steward of something larger than myself. One evening, Marcus and I were sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies come out. He said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if your dad hadn't left you the water rights?" I said, "All the time." He said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think Caleb would have sold the land, the development would have gone through, and I'd be working somewhere else. Maybe another farm. Maybe something completely different." He said, "Do you think you'd be happy?" I said, "Maybe. But not like this." He said, "What's different about this?" I said, "This is mine. I didn't inherit it whole. I earned it, piece by piece. That means something." He said, "It means everything." I thought about the day after the funeral, standing in the barn while Caleb told me I was no longer needed. I thought about the anger I'd felt, the fear, the disbelief that 15 years of work could be dismissed so easily. I thought about the water rights, the quiet gift Dad had left, and the way they'd shifted everything. And I thought about the lesson I'd learned, the one that had guided every decision since: the land doesn't belong to whoever holds the deed. It belongs to whoever tends it. Caleb had held the deed. But I'd held the water, and the water was what made the land live. That was the difference. That was everything. Marcus said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "How lucky I am." He said, "Lucky?" I said, "That my father knew me well enough to leave me exactly what I needed." Marcus said, "Not luck. Love." I said, "Yeah. Love." We sat in silence, watching the fireflies drift through the dusk, and I felt the weight of the land beneath me, solid and real and mine. Not because I'd demanded it. Not because I'd fought for it in some dramatic confrontation. But because I'd tended it. Because I'd waited. Because I'd understood that some battles are won not with noise, but with patience. The soil remembers who tends it. And in the end, it gives back what you put in. Not always immediately. Not always in the way you expect. But eventually. Always eventually. 20 years after the funeral, I stood in the same barn where Caleb had told me I was no longer needed. The barn had been renovated, new roof, reinforced beams, a fresh coat of paint, but it was still recognizably the same space. Leonard had retired the year before, and I'd promoted one of the younger workers, a woman named Jasmine who had a degree in sustainable agriculture and a fierce work ethic. She reminded me of myself at that age, hungry, determined, willing to do the hard work no one else wanted. The farm had grown to 400 acres. I'd purchased the adjoining property when the neighbor retired, using a combination of savings and another loan that I'd paid off in 5 years. The operation was diverse now: cotton, soybeans, vegetables, a small herd of cattle, the agritourism business, and a CSA program that served 200 families. I was 53 years old. My hair had started to gray. My hands were calloused and strong. I'd built a life I was proud of. Marcus and I had been married for 12 years. We'd built a house on the highest point of the property, a modest place with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the fields. We had 2 dogs, a vegetable garden, and a quiet life that suited us both. Caleb and I spoke occasionally, brief phone calls on birthdays and holidays. The anger between us had faded, replaced by a kind of distant cordiality. He'd done well in his law practice, made partner, built a comfortable life in Savannah. We were civil, but not close. He called one evening in late summer. He said, "Claire, I wanted to tell you something." I said, "Okay." He said, "I've been thinking a lot about the farm. About what happened after Dad died." I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to know that I understand now why he did what he did. Why he left you the water rights." I said, "Why do you think he did it?" He said, "Because he knew you'd stay. He knew you'd take care of the land in a way I never would. And he wanted to make sure you had the leverage to keep it. I said, that's probably true. He said, I was angry about it for a long time. I thought it was unfair, that he'd split the inheritance in a way that hurt me. I said, and now? He said, now I think it was the fairest thing he could have done. You earned that land. I just wanted to profit from it. I didn't say anything. He said, I'm proud of you, Claire. For what you've built. I felt something shift in my chest, a small release of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. I said, thank you. He said, I mean it. We talked for a few more minutes, surface-level updates about work and life. Before we hung up, he said, do you think Dad would be proud of what you've done? I said, I hope so. He said, I know so. After we hung up, I sat on the porch with Marcus. He asked what Caleb had said. I told him. Marcus said, that took courage. For him to say that. I said, it did. Marcus said, do you feel any different? Now that he's acknowledged it? I thought about it. I said, a little. But mostly I feel the same. I didn't build this for his approval. I built it because it needed building. Marcus said, that's the difference between you and him. I said, what is? He said, you don't need external validation. You know what you've done. I said, I learned that from the land. He said, how so? I said, the land doesn't care about your intentions or your excuses. It only responds to what you actually do. You can talk about farming all you want, but if you don't plant the seeds, nothing grows. Marcus said, and you planted. I said, yeah. I planted. We sat in silence, watching the sun set over fields I'd tended for 35 years, 15 as a farmhand, 20 as an owner. The light turned everything gold, the cotton and the soybeans and the distant tree line all glowing in the dusk. I thought about Dad, about the quiet way he'd set things in motion, the codicil he'd added without fanfare or explanation. I thought about the water rights, the leverage they'd given me, the way they'd forced Caleb to reckon with value he'd never considered. And I thought about the lesson I'd carry forward, the truth I'd learned in soil and sweat and stubborn refusal to accept someone else's version of my worth. Inheritance isn't just what's handed to you. It's what you do with what you're given. Caleb inherited land. I inherited water rights. He tried to sell. I chose to build. In the end, the land remembered who tended it. And it gave back accordingly. Not with dramatic justice or public vindication. Just with steady, reliable growth, the kind that comes from showing up, doing the work, and trusting that the ground beneath you will hold. That was my father's final gift. Not the water rights themselves, but the lesson they taught. Some things can't be bought or sold. They can only be earned. And once earned, they become the foundation for everything else. 25 years after the funeral, I stood in the renovated barn during the farm's annual harvest festival. The space was full, neighbors, customers, families with children running between the hay bales and the pumpkin displays. Jasmine was managing the farm stand, Leonard's son was giving tractor rides, and Marcus was grilling corn near the main house. I watched it all from the doorway, this thing I'd built, and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with completion. A young woman approached me, maybe 25, wearing jeans and boots. She said, "Excuse me, are you Claire?" I said, "I am." She said, "I'm Emma Voss. I received the Granger Farm Scholarship 3 years ago. I just wanted to say thank you." I said, "You're welcome. What are you doing now?" She said, "I'm finishing my master's in soil science. I want to work in sustainable agriculture, help small farms transition to regenerative practices." I said, "That's good work." She said, "It's because of people like you. You showed it's possible to run a profitable farm without destroying the land." I said, "It takes time." She said, "I know. But I'm willing to put in the time." I looked at her, this young woman with dirt under her nails and fire in her eyes, and I saw myself at that age. Before the farm was mine, before the water rights, before I understood what I was capable of. I said, if you ever need advice, or a reference, or just someone to talk to who understands, call me. She said, really? I said, really. She thanked me and disappeared into the crowd. Marcus found me a few minutes later. He said, you okay? I said, yeah. Just thinking. He said, about what? I said, about how strange it is that the worst day of my life led to the best thing I ever did. He said, the day your brother told you to leave? I said, yeah. He said, was it really the worst day? I thought about it. I said, at the time, yes. But looking back, it was the day I stopped waiting for permission and started building something that was mine. Marcus said, your father gave you permission. I said, no. He gave me leverage. I gave myself permission. Marcus smiled. He said, that's an important distinction. The festival ran until sunset. When the last guests had left and the cleanup was done, I walked out into the fields alone. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light across the rows of cotton. I thought about the 35 years I'd spent on this land. The blisters and the backaches, the failed crops and the good harvests, the loan payments and the slow accumulation of equity. I thought about Caleb, about the choice he'd made to sell, and the choice I'd made to stay. Neither choice was wrong. They were just different. He'd wanted liquidity, mobility, freedom from the land. I'd wanted roots, stability, something I could tend. We'd both gotten what we wanted. And in getting it, we'd both learned who we were. I walked back to the house, where Marcus was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of wine. I sat beside him and took one. He said, long day. I said, good day. He said, what are you going to do tomorrow? I said, same thing I do every day. Check the fields, talk to Jasmine about the winter planting schedule, maybe fix the irrigation line in the south field. He said, you ever think about slowing down? I said, sometimes. But then I think about all the things that still need doing, and I figure I'll slow down when they're done. He said, they'll never be done. I said, I know. He said, so you'll just keep working until you can't. I said, probably. He said, that's very you. I said, is it? He said, completely. We sat in comfortable silence, drinking our wine and watching the fields under the moonlight. And I thought about the question Emma had asked earlier, about how I'd shown it was possible to run a profitable farm without destroying the land. The answer wasn't complicated. You just had to care more about the land than the profit. You had to see it as something you were borrowing from the future, not something you owned outright. That was the lesson I'd learned from my father, and from the land itself, and from 35 years of showing up and doing the work. The land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. And if you tend it well, it tends you back. Not with guarantees or certainty, but with steady, reliable growth. The kind that lasts. 30 years after the funeral, I sold a conservation easement on 200 of the farm's 400 acres. The easement permanently protected the land from development, ensuring it would remain agricultural in perpetuity. The payment was $600,000, which I used to establish an endowment for the scholarship fund and to set up a land trust that would eventually take ownership of the farm after my death. Jasmine would manage it. We'd worked out the details with Richard, who was still practicing law in his 80s, sharp as ever. The trust would keep the farm operating, provide employment, and continue the educational programs we'd built. I was 63. Marcus was 65. We were both slowing down, spending more time on the porch and less time in the fields. But the farm was running smoothly, the operation was sustainable, and the land was protected. Caleb had retired from his law practice and moved to Florida. We talked a few times a year, friendly calls that never went too deep. He'd sold his house in Savannah and bought a condo on the coast. He seemed content. One afternoon, he called and said, "Claire, "I've been working on something, and I wanted to share it with you." I said, "Okay." He said, "I've been writing a memoir. Nothing fancy, just something for my kids, about growing up on the farm and the choices I made." I said, "That sounds nice." He said, "I wrote about what happened after Dad died. About the water rights, the sale that fell through, the way you ended up buying the land." I said, "What did you write?" He said, "That I was an arrogant fool who thought I knew better than everyone else. That I underestimated you, and it cost me the farm." I said, "You didn't lose the farm. You sold it." He said, "To you. For half what it was worth." I said, "It was worth exactly what you got, given that I held the water rights." He laughed. He said, "That's true. But still. I wanted to write it down, so my kids would know that I made mistakes, and that those mistakes had consequences." I said, "That's honest." He said, "I learned that from you." We talked for a while longer, about his grandchildren, about his life in Florida, about the farm and how it was doing. Before we hung up, he said, "I'm proud of what you built, Claire. I hope you know that." I said, "I know." He said, "I wish I'd said it sooner." I said, "You're saying it now. That's enough." After we hung up, I sat on the porch and thought about forgiveness, about anger, about the long slow process of letting go of hurt. I'd forgiven Caleb years ago, not because he'd apologized but because holding on to anger was exhausting. But hearing him acknowledge what had happened, hearing him name his mistakes, that meant something. Not because I needed his validation, but because it closed a loop I hadn't realized was still open. Marcus joined me on the porch. He said, "Caleb?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "What did he want?" I told him. Marcus said, "That took a lot. For him to admit he was wrong." I said, "It did." Marcus said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Lighter." We sat in silence, watching the sun set over the fields I'd tended for 40 years. The land was green and lush, the crops thriving, the irrigation system running smoothly. Everything I'd built was here. The farm, the scholarship, the land trust. The life I'd chosen, the work I'd done, the legacy I'd leave behind. It wasn't perfect. There had been hard years, failed crops, financial scares. But it was mine, and it was real, and it had mattered. That was enough. More than enough. Everything. The next morning, I walked out into the fields at dawn, the way I'd done for 40 years. The air was cool, the sky just starting to lighten. The cotton was waist-high, the leaves heavy with dew. I ran my hand over the plants, felt the rough texture of the leaves, and thought about all the seasons I'd seen, all the cycles of planting and harvest, growth and rest. I thought about my father, about the water rights he'd left me, about the quiet way he'd ensured I'd have what I needed. I thought about Caleb, about the anger and the reconciliation, the long years of distance and the recent warmth. I thought about Marcus, about the life we'd built together, the partnership we'd forged. And I thought about the land itself, the soil and the water and the minerals beneath, the layers of value that couldn't be seen but could be felt. This was what I'd learned in 40 years of farming. The land doesn't care about your plans or your pride. It only responds to what you give it. And if you give it time, attention, and care, it gives back, not always in the way you expect, but always in proportion to what you've invested. That's true of land. It's true of relationships. It's true of life. You can't force growth. You can only create the conditions for it, and then wait. I walked back to the house as the sun crested the horizon, painting the fields in shades of gold and amber. Marcus was in the kitchen making coffee. The dogs were asleep on the porch. Everything was exactly where it should be. I'd started as a farmhand, someone who worked land I didn't own. I'd become an owner, a steward, a builder of something that would outlast me. Not because I was special. But because I'd stayed. Because I'd tended. Because I'd refused to let someone else's vision of value override my own. The soil remembers who tends it. And in the end, it's the tending that matters. Not the title. Not the deed. Not the moment of inheritance. Just the quiet, steady work of showing up, day after day, and putting your hands in the earth. That's legacy. That's love. That's enough.